Okay, here we are. This is the final period of church history that we're going to look at in our 4 week overview here. And we're going to bring it up to the current day. All right, so this is the new springtime. We just did, let's see, modern revolutions and modernism 2 days ago. Then we had the church during the world wars, so a world at war. Now we've got the new springtime. This is going to be a lot more focused on the church itself. All right, so 58 to the present day. Okay, the Second Vatican Council, aka Vatican II, is really the defining event of the past 75 years in the church's history. Even some secular scholars have called it the most significant religious event in the 20th century. Okay, it's a huge deal. So it issued 16 documents covering a whole range of issues here. So you have four constitutions, three dogmatic constitutions, one pastoral constitution. These are called the four pillars of Vatican II. These are really the longest and most theologically impactful ones. So you got Lumen Gentium, which we've read some of, which is addressing the church, the actual nature of the church. Sacrosanctum Concilium is about the liturgy, including the Mass. Dei Verbum is on divine revelation, and that has to do with scripture and tradition and the inspiration of scripture and all those things. And then Gaudium et Spes, which is on the church in the modern world. That talks about the relationship between the church and the rest of the world in the modern era. Okay. In addition to that, you have 9 decrees, which are slightly less authoritative, less weighty, shorter, and they address specific issues. So you got decrees on the modern media. That's a comma that shouldn't be there. So what's the proper way to use the modern media? Of course, at that point you had radio, you had TV. You didn't have the internet yet, okay, but the principles in that decree apply to the internet as well. The renewal of religious life, so they're looking to renew consecrated life, okay, the life, different forms of living out the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The apostolate of the laity, so what is the laity's role in the church and in the mission of the church, being the kingdom, spreading the kingdom throughout the world. So the laity become much more important through Vatican II. There was sort of a movement in that direction prior to the council, and the council launches that even further forward. Missionary activity and more. Okay, so there's a lot that we cover on decrees. And then 3 declarations, which are even a little shorter and a little more specific than the decrees. Religious freedom, the Declaration on Religious Freedom is a big one. Okay, here we see the church has matured in its understanding of the concept of religious freedom. Remember, when the Enlightenment was happening, one of the big things was freedom of conscience. Okay, the idea that we shouldn't have a state religion and that people should be able to believe what they want. Okay, and the church came out and said, you can't say you don't have a right to believe things that are false. So freedom of conscience is not true freedom, okay? Because you don't, morally speaking, have the right to believe things that are not true and to worship false gods and so on, okay? So here we see Vatican II says, yeah, that's true. Morally speaking, it's not right to worship false gods or to believe what is false, okay? However, the government does not have the right to impose or persecute or oppress religions necessarily, even if they're false. Okay. So the dignity of the human person requires some amount of freedom or latitude in seeking the truth. Okay. So this is really saying, politically speaking, that freedom of religion is legitimate. You should have a political right to believe things which even though they're objectively false. Okay. Um, Even though morally speaking, okay, you only have a right to believe what is true and to worship the true God. Okay. All right. So it's a kind of careful definition there. It addresses that, and then Christian education, and then the relationship between the church and non-Christian religions. Okay. Okay. I think, yeah. So religious freedom. I think that that's a fair enough summary of it right there, without getting into too much more detail. All right. So the church right now in 2020, we're still in the process of interpreting the documents of Vatican II and applying them to the life of the church um, and to kind of theological development. Okay, so that's still very much happening. We're in the shadow of Vatican II. John Paul II, then, our patron saint as a school, has one of the longest times as Pope in the history of the Church, one of the longest pontificates. He's Pope from 1978 until 2005 when he dies. Okay, so he does a ton of things, over a quarter century as Pope. And then basically renewal, controversy, schism, and even scandal. Okay, so renewal because there has been renewal in terms of lay spirituality, the charismatic renewal, um, religious life has grown in certain ways. Controversy, theologically speaking, especially. We'll talk about a schism on the next slide. And scandal, okay? We have all experienced now the sex abuse scandal that the church has gone through and is still dealing with. Okay, so that's all happening. Go ahead and answer the first question there. All right. So major events, of course, the Second Vatican Council itself from 62 to 65. St. John the 23rd called the council. He later died, and Pope Paul VI actually finished the council. All right, 1968, so a few years after the council, Paul VI, who is now canonized as well, he issued Humanae Vitae, which is an encyclical or a letter to the entire church from the Pope, reaffirming the church's teaching on contraception or birth control, condemning that, saying morally that's not acceptable. This has been controversial because, of course, 1968, this happens at the peak of the sexual revolution, okay? So the world is moving towards contraception, and the church is saying, no, hold that train, we're not going to go there, okay? All right. 1969, then the following year, Paul VI reveals the Novus Ordo Mass. Now, the idea behind the Novus Ordo is this is supposed to be kind of an update of the Mass, and it's supposed to follow what Vatican II says in Sacrosanctum Concilium. One of the big things was taking the Mass out of Latin and allowing for the vernacular languages, hence how we have the Mass in English, okay? As opposed to the Tridentine Mass, which was all in Latin. All right. So the Tridentine Mass gets replaced with the current Mass that we have, which is the Novus Ordo. All right, 78, then you get Archbishop Karol Wojtyła, who is from Poland. He's then elected and becomes Pope John Paul II in 1978. Over the next 6 or 5 years, rather, he delivers his talks on the theology of the body during his Wednesday addresses as Pope. So these were basically lectures that are given publicly and collected. Now you can get it in book form. 1979, that same year, Mother Teresa receives the Nobel Peace Prize. So St. Teresa of Calcutta had been working with the poorest of the poor in India for years up to this point. All right, jump forward a little bit. 1993, the current Catechism of the Catholic Church is issued by John Paul II. Of course, that is updated in light of all of the things that Vatican II said, which is a ton. I mean, I've got a 1,000-page book of Vatican II's documents. Okay, Vatican II wrote more, I think, than all previous church councils combined. All right, so the Catechism gets updated with all of that, and that's the form that we have now. 2005, then JP2 dies, and the Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was the chief kind of teaching portion of the Vatican, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, he then becomes Pope Benedict XVI. He and John Paul II were very close, theologically and just personally as well. Then, of course, 2013, Pope Benedict XVI resigns, supposedly due to age and ill health, but there are other theories swirling around as to why he might have resigned, because that's an extremely rare thing for the Pope to do. But then anyway, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio becomes Pope Francis in 2013. And of course, he's the current Pope. All right, go ahead, do question 2. Okay, major people and saints. Okay, saintly popes. So John the 23rd, who called Vatican II, Paul VI, who finished Vatican II, and then John Paul II, All of them have been officially canonized. They are all saints. Saint Gianna Molla is in here. So Gianna Molla was a pediatrician, and she got pregnant with her fourth child, and she had a fibroma, I believe it was, something on her uterus which endangered her life. And so her treatment options included removing the fibroma, which would probably not end up saving her, or getting an abortion or getting a hysterectomy, which of course is the removal of the uterus. Um, the hysterectomy and the abortion, of course, would kill the baby. The hysterectomy would have been morally acceptable because the death of the child would have been an unintended consequence. So she could have gotten the hysterectomy, but it would have certainly killed her child. So she refused to get the abortion, and she chose not to get the hysterectomy because she wanted her child to live. Instead, she got the surgery to remove the fibroma, and then a week after her child was born, she died. Okay, so she gave her life for her child there. Padre Pio. Padre Pio is a complex character, all right, but he was a priest. In fact, he was a Franciscan Capuchin brother, and he was a mystic. He had the stigmata, right, so the wounds in his hands, in his side, and on his feet. Basically channeling the wounds of Christ were made present in him as well. So he's a complex figure, but a pretty remarkable character as well. Teresa of Calcutta, aka Mother Teresa, of course, working with the poorest of the poor in India. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre is a very interesting figure too. So he founded, after Vatican II, founded the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX. Okay, he was committed to the Latin Mass, even after the Novus Ordo came out, and traditional priestly formation. He had his faculties to ordain priests and bishops removed, eventually had his faculties to perform the Mass also removed, okay, because it was thought that he was heretical or something close to it. So then he ordained 4 bishops after having those faculties taken away, and he gets excommunicated by Pope John Paul II. So this is the Lefebvrean schism, or the schism with the Society of St. Pius X. The excommunication was then lifted in 2009, I believe, by Pope Benedict XVI, but technically it's not clear if they're actually in full communion with us now. All right, speaking of Benedict XVI, he is the first pope to resign of his own initiative since Pope Celestine V in 1294. Okay, so over 700 years since this happened. Hence why there is so much speculation as to why he actually resigned. Okay, he's still alive. He's very old, but he is still alive. And then Pope Francis, of course, is our current pope. First Jesuit pope, first pope from the Western Hemisphere, the first non-European pope in 1,300 years, I want to say. Okay, so a lot of firsts for Pope Francis, current pope. All right, go do question 3, and then go ahead and pick one of these. Give me a paragraph on them. And then we'll take our quiz tomorrow, and then we'll move into a movie starting next week. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and I'm excited for next week. All right.